there is coffee, so help yourself to that. Okay. Good. Well, how are we doing? Are you guys finding it helpful? Good. I'm so glad. Let me get my microphone on here. Here's what we're going to do this afternoon. It's our final session today. We are going to, I'd like to just take a few minutes and cover a couple of the things I neglected in the earlier session that I think are important. I'd like to end with just a quick little Q&A on this session of what is ideological social justice. See if there's anything that we want to explore a little further there. I want you guys to have a pretty good idea of what this is by the time we're done. And then we'll move into a few minutes at least on how's the church responding? How's the church in the United States particularly responding to this movement in the culture? And I've got some thoughts on that and kind of share with you my perspective on that and some thoughts on how we ought to maybe go forward. So that's where we're going to head this afternoon. And then tomorrow is the last session. That'll be the practical, okay, what do we do as we go back to our places of work, family, and whatnot with this? So I'll give you some thoughts on that as well. So let me do the slides again, if we could, guys, back in the back, and if I could maybe have some of those lights shut off there. So I want to talk about the idea of equity. Two ideas, equity and diversity, are really core values of ideological social justice, equality or equity. So all worldviews kind of shape values, right? You can think about worldviews as the foundation of the building, or maybe a better way of saying it is worldviews are kind of like the roots of a tree, right? They're underground. You don't really see them, but everything kind of flows from them. So then the values would be like the trunk of that tree. You can see it. You can kind of see that a little bit better. And worldviews shape values. What's important, what's valuable, what's not. Disvalues too. What's not valuable. And there's two values that really do rise to the surface of this worldview, equity and diversity. I want to talk about those just here briefly. So to rightly comprehend ideological social justice, ideological social justice is all about unmasking and overthrowing oppressive systems. That's in the definition. But what makes these structures oppressive? They're oppressive because they perpetuate disparities or unequal outcomes. And that word, equity or equality, is a central value of social justice. Now, the Bible also talks about equality. So this is, in fact, a biblical value as well, but it's going to talk about equality differently than the ideology of social justice. So when we think about equality biblically, we think primarily in terms of the equality that people have because we're made in God's image, right? I mean, that gives us a certain equality. It doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, white, black. All of us have this equal dignity and worth as image bearers of God. There's an equality there. There's also an equality in the Bible in terms of our sin nature, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So there's an equality in terms of sin nature as well. And there's an equality in the Bible in terms of God's justice, right? He's going to judge us without partiality, equally, right? All of us are going to be judged with equality before the law by Jesus. So he's not going to favor or he's not going to give partiality to anyone. So this concept of equality comes into societies that have been shaped by a biblical worldview. Okay, it's important that we see kind of what is equality from the Bible standpoint before we start grappling with it from the standpoint of ideological social justice. With this worldview, though, equality means equality of outcome in a world without disparity. So it's, again, borrowing this from the old Marxism, the Marxism 101. We've got a kind of, in communist states, right, everyone had to kind of look alike, dress alike, and most importantly, they had to think alike. And everyone had to have the same amount of property and blah, blah, blah. It had to be this kind of equality of outcome. And that's what ideological social justice is pushing for as well. C.S. Lewis captured this kind of vision of equality this way. He said, "Let no man live who is wiser or better or more famous or even handsomer than the mass. Cut them all down to a level. All slaves, all ciphers, all nobodies, all equal. Okay, that's the kind of the classic Marxist idea of equality, right? Equality of outcome. Everyone's got to be the same, and that kind of played itself out in every one of these communist countries. Now, social justice ideology conflates differences or disparities in society with injustice, with oppression. So whenever there is a disparity between groups, for example, the ideology of social justice is going to assume that the cause of that disparity must lie with some kind of systemic injustice, systemic racism, sexism, etc. So let's give some examples so we know what we're talking about. You might remember Google made the news a few years back because there was a young tech engineer at Google named James Damore. And Google at that time was struggling with the fact that their computer software engineers were, I think it was something like 80-20. 80% of them were men, 20% were women. So there was a disparity, right? And they were struggling with that disparity because their social justice blinders say where there's a disparity, there must be what? Some kind of institutional, structural injustice going on. In this case, what is it? Sexism, right? So there's some sexism going on. And we've got sexism in our systems. We've got to root it out somehow in order to have a 50-50 parity between male and female computer tech engineers. Now, James Damore thought about that and he said, well, okay, you might have disparities here between men and women because of sexism. That's a possibility. But maybe there's a disparity here because of other reasons. Maybe it's a little bit more complicated than just sexism or some kind of bias. Maybe, for example, this is getting dangerous, maybe men and women are a little bit different. Maybe women have, not everyone, of course, but on the whole, kind of, a dispensation that's a little bit different than men do in terms of aptitudes or interests or things like that, right? And that's playing out in vocational areas like this, right? Maybe it has nothing to do with sexism, And so he was writing memos inside of Google about this, like, well, maybe sexism isn't the cause. Maybe we don't need to kind of do these heavy-handed, human resource things that are going to make it harder for men to get in and easier for women. Maybe we just need to, not worry about that, and he started citing some studies about kind of relative makeup of women and interests and whatnot, and he was fired. So can't ask questions like that, right, at Google. Or you could take the example of the Minnesota Public Schools. This is one that I came across in study for my book that I thought was fascinating. And this is true of public schools probably in many cities, Minnesota Public Schools. There was a disparity between the number of black students and white students that were being expelled based on their percents of the overall population, right? So disparity in this worldview means one thing and one thing only. Discrimination, racism, structural racism. In this case, the school district is the teachers somehow. They're unconsciously racist. That's working its way out in this structure of inequality between the black and white students being expelled. And so what did they do? What's the solution? You've got to have an equality of outcome. We've got to get the same basic numbers of black and white kids being expelled. Well, how do we do that? That gets tricky. You can't really expel white kids for not doing anything wrong, right? That would be clearly bad. So we'll just not expel the black kids who are deserving to be expelled in order to get that equity in line. And that's what they did. And you can imagine what happened in that school district when you're not expelling kids whose behavior deserves, or calls that you should call for them to be expelled. It's chaos. So, but that's the driving. You can see the MO there. It's this equality of outcome. That's what we want. Wherever we see disparities, that's where and you see it especially with the Biden administration right now. They're pushing this heavily into every area, schools, corporations, And they're using the word equity, right? We've got to get this equity. So that's a key value in social justice. I think for us, that's not just, right? That's going to lead to injustice, right? You're going to have injustice. When you don't expel kids who deserve to be expelled, or you expel kids who don't deserve to be expelled, that's called unjust, right? That's an injustice. Justice has to be based on the truth, can't be partial. And the Bible, by the way, doesn't make a big deal out of this issue of inequity, so to speak, or disparity. Disparity is not a particularly, strongly fought against, whatever you want to say, idea in the Bible. And you see this, for example, in the parable of the talents, right? Jesus comes to these guys, or the ruler comes to these guys and gives them different amounts, right? Some get 3, some get 2, some get 1. Right? What's that? According to their ability, right? Yeah. And of course, we are different. God's made us different. We have different interests. We have choice that we make, and the choices that we make lead to different outcomes. And God's going to respect that, right? He's not going to force or coerce us in any way to have an outcome that doesn't go along or support choices that we make. So we're going to have disparities. Not all disparities are bad, right? I can't play in the NBA, right? There's going to be a disparity in the NBA between white and black players. There just is. Is that bad? No. We accept that. That's fine. So it's interesting in college sports, it's still merit-based, right? It's still merit-based, but not when it comes to the academic side. Then it's not. Merit's out now. And now we got to have equality of outcome in that. I wonder what happens sometimes. I really do. You would think this ideology is just going to force that to come into sports. It is a little bit on the trans thing, but I don't know. Sports are pretty sacrosanct here, so it hasn't happened yet. We'll see. So equity, diversity. Let's talk about that. Well, does the Bible have anything to say about diversity? Is diversity a value in the Scriptures? What do you think? I would say yes, of course. And where do we see it, right, in particular? Well, particularly through the book of God's world, right? We just look at creation. That's really where you see God's value of diversity, is in the world that he made, right? He didn't just make one kind of tree, right? He made lots of kinds of trees, lots of kinds of flowers. Didn't have to. Yeah, lots of insects, lots of people. Every one of us is different. Yet the Bible always balances unity and diversity. And healthy societies require a balance of unity and diversity. Actually, both of them are needed in a healthy society. And Bible creates a balance. It values the individual, but it also values the community, right? Both of these things are important. It values the individual, values the church, values the state, or whatever it is, the family. So unity, diversity is a really important thing in the Bible. You see that in the Godhead himself, right? Right in God's own nature. God is one, unity. God is three persons. There's a distinction between the three persons, right? And that distinction matters. Those different, the differences in the Godhead matter. And you see that coming into even the human realm through marriage, right? The marriage is in some way a reflection of the Godhead. God could have made man in his image just as man, but he chose to make man male and female in union, right? Coming together in marriage, right? Is kind of this picture of human nature that mirrors the Godhead in some ways, right? So diversity is a biblical value as well. It's something we ought to value. So maybe we share that then with ideological social justice, right? Perhaps. Maybe we share that value. Not quite, okay? When ideological social justice speaks of diversity, it actually doesn't have nearly as rich of an understanding of diversity that the biblical worldview does. It means diversity at a very limited level. Diversity around a few limited areas: skin color, sex, and gender, okay? That's it. So, like take, for example, diversity within a racial grouping, for example. A diversity that comes from letting people be individuals and think for themselves. No, we don't like that. There we want uniformity, right? And really what you have in ideological social justice is a push for uniformity at the base. It's really a push to conform under the kind of the euphemism of diversity. I would say this value of diversity is kind of a euphemism in there. For example, let's go on to the next slide. This quote from Ayanna Pressley. She's a U.S. Senator from the state of Massachusetts, and she spoke at Netroots Nation about 2 years ago, and she said this, and it struck a lot of people, myself included. She says, "We don't need any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. We don't need any more black faces that don't want to be a black voice. We don't want any more Muslims that don't want to be a Muslim voice. We don't need any more queers that don't want to be a queer voice." Well, what was her point? If you're brown, black, Muslim, or queer, and you don't think and speak like your group, you're not needed. We don't want you. Get with the group, conform, or get out. That's what she's saying. That she's really speaking, I think, very clearly from this ideology of social justice. Yeah, diversity, but only up to a point. Okay, we don't want diversity of individual thought within a group. So, and I think, you see this as well in diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Inclusion is also a euphemism that, okay, inclusion for some, but certainly not for others, right? So that's a very limited value, even though they love to trumpet that. People love to signal their virtue by putting signs in their yards that talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, but it's very limited. If you're a white male, don't expect to be celebrated for inclusion, okay? You got to get out. You got to kind of excuse yourself or be expected to be excused. So anyways, kind of euphemisms there. Let's talk about if those are values, what are disvalues? I would say huge disvalue is American history, Western civilization as a whole is a disvalue. For proponents of ideological social justice, Western civilization is evil. Its defining characteristics are slavery, colonization, greed, exploitation, racial superiority, imperialism, and genocide. That's what it means to be the West. So for the millions who have been taught this narrative of Western history, the West is, in the words of one student at Claremont Pacific, I think it was, a mythos of white power imbibed by white supremacists. He went on and he said that Western civilization has given rise to interlocking systems of domination that produce the lethal conditions under which oppressed peoples are forced to live. That's the view of the West, that people that are shaped by this ideology that they have. For them, these systems include a toxic brew of capitalism, whiteness, traditional marriage, the male-female binary. All of these things coming from the West are oppressive. They all have to be thrown onto the trash heap of history. And so this very kind of, what you see with ideological social justice when it looks particularly at history is it's going to be very biased, very one-sided. It's going to look only at the negative. You see this in the 1619 Project, for example. We're going to make America's founding not about freedom and human dignity. We're going to make it all about slavery, right? So was slavery real? Yeah. Should American history be reduced to slavery? No. Okay. And that gets to my point about how should we as Christians view history? How do we view history? What's important in terms of our understanding of history? Well, I would say Christians are called to have a very nuanced and frankly a very truthful as possible, a truthful view of history. Christians that are studying history are on a quest for truth, okay? Not that we can ever know it perfectly. You can't, but it's a quest. We want to know what actually happened. In fact, our faith is kind of based on that, isn't it, right? If Jesus, Paul says, didn't rise from the dead historically, if that didn't happen in history, then our faith is worthless, right? So history matters to us. We want to tell history truthfully. And one of the reasons I was attracted to Christianity as a young man was this very issue. I studied, as I was reading the Bible, I was really struck with how truthful these historical accounts were, especially in the Old Testament. Like, the greatest king in the Old Testament, King David, right? I mean, you see the good, the bad, and the ugly with that guy. There's nothing hidden, right? It's really striking because if you look at other histories of great leaders, right, they're going to whitewash all the bad stuff away, right? He's going to be some kind of like Kim Jong-un, perfect kind of person, right? But the Bible just lays it out there, and it's just very honest. And at the end of the day, there's also grace, though, right? I mean, God calls David a man after my own heart, and he does that even despite the fact that he committed some of the most wicked sins that any human being could ever commit. So there's this graciousness. Why? Because we're all fallen, right? We're all sinful people. So we have to look back at our forebears with the same kind of grace, essentially, and understanding that we'd want extended to us by the people that come after us, right? But with social justice, you don't get that. Right now, there's this kind of really, I think, noxious kind of moral superiority towards people that came before us. And you see this driving the tearing down of our statues and whatnot, right? They're looking at real things. These aren't perfect people. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, right? And you can go on and on. But they're completely ignoring any kind of virtue, right? And I just think that's so unbiblical. It's so wrong. We always need to judge people kind of on the balance, right, of the good and the bad, right? We can't just, like if I couldn't have a relationship with Kim, for example, if all she did was bring to mind all the bad things that I've done, which are plenty, I'm telling you, right? I mean, if she kept bringing that up day after day, and that was the relationship we had, was just how bad you are, we couldn't have a relationship. And so we have to be that same way with our forebears. Yeah, let's not hide from the bad things that they've done. I want my kids to know about slavery, Jim Crow, and the way we treated Native Americans. I want them to see the bad. But believe me, I want them to be proud of the good. And there's a lot of good, because that good is a gift from God, ultimately, that's been passed down through people that we should be grateful, right? The big virtue in the Bible is gratitude. And gratitude is a virtue that does not exist in ideological social justice. It's just gone. No gratitude. So again, I view this as an existential threat that we're facing, because when you strip away things like grace, mercy, forgiveness, redemption, reconciliation, gratitude, what kind of society are you left with? Can you even have, literally, could you have a society without those things? I don't think so. I think it falls apart. So let me just end this. I'm going to move on to the next session, but I wanted to end with a story. Let me pull it up here. Let me, Phil, remind me what time we're finished here. Okay, 2:30, great, yeah. Excuse me while I pull this up. Okay. I wanted to end with the story of what does ideological social justice look like in community when it's put into practice? What's the fruit? How do we see it? And there's a lot of examples now. I could choose from a lot of examples, but for whatever reason, this one really struck me as being just a really clear kind of picture of what the future holds for us if we stay on this trajectory of kind of enabling this worldview in our society. And it's the story of Gibson's Bakery in Ohio. Do you remember that story that was in the news a few years ago? So I'm going to read it from the book here. The story, according to Tom Gibson, who is the owner of the family bakery, begins in Oberlin, Ohio in the fall of 2016. Oberlin, Ohio is a college town, and it's a private liberal arts college, Oberlin College there in Oberlin, Ohio. He wrote this in the USA Today newspaper. He said, "We own and operate Gibson's Bakery in the city of Oberlin, Ohio, home to Oberlin College, for more than 130 years. Wow. Our family has worked hard to build a reputation for our homemade baked goods, candy, and ice cream, and on our commitment to our community. The bakery has long been a popular stop among students, residents, and returning alumni. Our family and our business Business's reputation was a source of great pride for generations. But all that changed on November 9th, 2016, when a student attempted to shoplift 2 bottles of wine from our store. Police arrived and arrested the student. But the next day, hundreds of people gathered in protest, and from bullhorns, they called for a boycott. The sidewalk and the park across the street from our store were filled with protesters holding signs labeling us racists and white supremacists. The arrest, they said, was the result of racial profiling. The narrative was set. There was no combating it. Despite the lack of any evidence, our family was accused of a long history of racism and discrimination. Oberlin College officials ordered the suspension of more than a 100-year business relationship with our bakery, and our customers dwindled. We were officially on trial, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, and we were losing. As time went on, the truth began to emerge. The shoplifter confessed his crime and said that the arrest was not racially motivated. He was a black young man. But Oberlin College refused to help to set the record straight by issuing a public statement that our family is not racist and does not have a history of racial profiling or discrimination. The damage had been done, and the truth seemed irrelevant. Notice how I said in ideological social justice, truth is not a value. It's not valued. The truth seemed irrelevant. In a small city like Oberlin, having the largest business and employer against you is more than enough to seal your fate. Running out of options, we decided to pursue a lawsuit against Oberlin College. 2 regional law firms agreed to take up our case. What few understand is that this situation not only affected our business, but it touched every aspect of our lives. In the end, the words of my father inspired me to continue the fight. He said, quote, "In my life, I've done everything that I could to treat all people with dignity and respect, and now that I'm nearing the end of my life, I'm going to die being labeled a racist." There wasn't time that he feared to set the record straight. His legacy had been tarnished, and he felt powerless to stop it. This experience has taught me that reputations are fragile things. They take a lifetime to build, but only moments to destroy. And in an age where social media can spread lies with alarming quickness, what happened at Gibson's Bakery could happen anywhere. Just a couple of things on this story. I want you to see how the presuppositions that we've been talking about of ideological social justice are playing out in this story. First of all, as I said, truth, facts, and evidence didn't matter. This just didn't matter here. Gibson's daughter said the truth seemed irrelevant. Despite the lack of any evidence, our family was accused of being racist. How could they make that accusation without any evidence of racism? How? According to this ideology. Put your lenses on. You're seeing the world through this ideology. How can you do that then? They're white. That's all you need to know. They've benefited from that, systems of racism. Narrative replaces the truth. He said the narrative was set. There was no replacing it, right? Truth doesn't matter. What actually happened doesn't matter. The story that we tell about what happened is reality. That becomes reality, this postmodern idea that we can kind of create reality through the stories that we tell. That story is what matters, the story we tell. Now, following the logic of intersectionality, the perpetrator, who was a person of color, was cast as the victim, while the victim, Gibson, a white man, was cast as the villain. You also see mob justice. You see shaming, intimidation. All of these tactics are utilized. You see something I haven't talked about, but you see institutional backing that supported the mob from Oberlin College itself, gave a lot of backing to the protests, and really to this day hasn't stopped. It's interesting. I put this story in this book just because it struck me. I got a Facebook message about a week ago from this daughter of Tom Gibson. Somebody had given her the book. I was so gratified by that, and she just thanked me. She said, "Thanks for recognizing us in your book. And some people from out of state have read your book, and they're coming in and buying baked goods for that reason. And gosh, it just blessed my heart when I heard that. And she said, "Send me a signed copy." So I don't know her or this family at all, but I was really touched by that. She said it's been very hard. I exchanged a few emails with her or messages, and she said that they actually took this to court. They accused the college of when somebody libel, and they won in the first round, but it's now in the appeal court, and they're losing. So she said that it's looking pretty bleak right now that we're gonna prevail in this court case, and I could just tell right now today, her heart was really heavy, and I just my heart went out to her because they've had to fight this, and just think how horrible this is for these people, and think how it's all built on a lie, and think how unjust it is. All of this injustice is happening under the label of justice, fighting for justice. So, anyways, I want to end there. To me, as I conclude, just some thoughts. I put this in the book, but what do we see? What are the fruits that we're seeing from stories like this and in our society as a result of ideological social justice? We're seeing less gratitude and more grievance, right? We're seeing less personal responsibility and more claims of victimhood. We're seeing an erosion of the rule of law. We're seeing moral norms becoming arbitrary, constantly changing. We're seeing a loss of due process, things like innocent until proven guilty. No, that's going away. We're seeing a loss of free speech and debate because those things really are pursuit of truth, aren't they? So now we need to shut down free speech and debate. The problem is when you do that, you take the pressure valve off. Once you can't talk about something, the things that, what you end up doing is resorting to force. So it's very dangerous when you take away free speech. Loss of truth in this rise of a pervasive culture of narrative creation and the perpetuation of narratives in service of ever greater power and control. You're seeing an erosion of religious liberty. Why? Because religious liberty is viewed as a kind of mask to hide intolerance and bigotry against sexual minorities, right? So we need to go after religious liberty. It's actually an oppressive structure. We're seeing a loss of the gospel because social justice is incompatible with the Christian gospel, as we said. And finally, we're seeing just a loss of basic civility, social unity, cohesion, tolerance. Instead of live and let live, you have retribution. No more love your neighbor, much less love your enemy. So the fruit of this ideology is bitter and it's destructive. And so not the times that we want to live in, folks, right? But the times that God has chosen for us nevertheless. And so let's not abandon the responsibility that God's given us to be lights for truth, for justice, for genuine equality, for genuine diversity in our societies right now. Let's take a few questions and then we'll move on to the church issue. How do we see this coming into the church? Does that sound okay? Is that okay, Phil? Okay. Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, sorry, questions or maybe questions or comments. If you have a thought, that's fine as well. You'd like to share. Just do this for a few minutes, and then we'll move on here. Go ahead there with the microphone. Thanks. Yeah.
I want to thank you and give all glory to God for one of the things in the book that we recognized through our men's study. And as I was reading it, is that you show a lot of grace toward those in the church that have walked away from the faith as we see it. And I want to thank you for that. But I just want to ask a question on the flip of that is when do we say that they went out from us because they're not of us? Because this is really, and I know you're going to talk probably a little bit about that in the next session, but
yeah.
This is really, they're way off. That man can't receive forgiveness.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I mean, what a perversion of the gospel.
Right. Right.
And, you know,
Yeah. I
but I do thank you for your kindness that you show toward.
I think for fellow believers, and my conviction is that people, my fellow Christian believers that I've known in my life that have imbibed this, their intentions are good, and I'll talk about that. They want to do what's right. They just don't know enough about biblical justice, in my view, to see the difference between, again, the original and the counterfeit. But their intentions are good, and so I in no way want to malign them. I want to tell them, I want to start with that. Your intentions are good. But guys, what you're talking about isn't biblical, and I think that's where I want to go next, is to try as clearly as I can to show them why this isn't biblical. Now, if after that, they still kind of feel like, no, you're wrong, I'm right, then yeah, we might have to talk about separating, because these are too important, I think. So yeah. And that's happening. So, other comments or questions on this session? Yes.
So I've had this question actually for a long time. Who do the ideological social justice warriors see as oppressors in countries that are not dominated by other than whites?
Mm.
So we have whole continents like Africa and Asia and South America that are not white dominant cultures. So
Right.
how do they explain that? Or are we just bad wherever we're white?
Well, and if you're in Africa, the way that this ideology comes into play is not so much, it's through the lens of colonialism. And so the bad guys in that story are going to be, Europeans who colonized a lot of the countries of Africa. And so they're the villains. And again, there's some reality to that, right? There was a lot of oppression that came with the colonization, although it's often very nuanced, especially with British colonies. But that's the way that they would, they would see that in a place like Africa, for example. Yeah.
With Africa, certainly.
Yeah.
But what about
Yeah.
Asia? I mean, that's a quarter of the world's population, and they oppress whites and Asian minorities and religious minorities, everybody.
Yeah, it's a puzzling thing, and I can't say I understand the answers to it. One of the things that really I found very puzzling was after the Floyd riots, the Black Lives Matter riots last summer, you remember it spread around the world, mostly in Western or English-speaking countries, England, Australia, New Zealand. They were rioting for what happened in Minnesota. And they were accusing their own governments of the same thing that we're accusing our governments was. And I just found that to be very puzzling because their histories are different. But for whatever reason, they just absorbed it like whole cloth from the United States. And actually, it's interesting. Recently, the Prime Minister of France, Macron, who's not a conservative Christian by any stretch, recognized that dynamic. He said, this is all coming from the universities of the United States, and it's not helpful. So we don't need this in France, So yes, other questions or comments?
So within this ideological social justice, there doesn't seem to be a particular leader or group of leaders. It just seems to be kind of very broad. How does this not self-destruct all on its own? That is just so foreign to me, that it's a system with no structure.
Oh, with no structure.
Except it seems to have a structure, but it's so different depending on whether you're in one place or another. It can look so different.
Right. Yeah. I think those are really good observations. There is a structure, not a structure. It is decentralized. Okay, so it's a decentralized kind of movement or ideology. But you know what? So is biblical Christianity in a sense, right? I mean, we're not in the days of the old Holy Roman Empire Christendom, right, where the Pope was over the whole church and there was this kind of defined structure. I mean, it's pretty decentralized. Our own movement is, right? And movements actually work pretty well. They can in a decentralized kind of a mode. And so I think this one as well is just, it's operating in a decentralized way. But there are certain key influential groups, within it for sure. There's some big donors that are behind it. There's some real strategy that's gone into it. And usually that strategy comes out of nonprofits. So there's a lot of nonprofits, like for example, the human rights, what's it called? The Human Rights Campaign. And there's any number of, Black Lives Matter is another one, right? That's a huge, huge organization now. So there's a lot of, but I think the structure, the organizing comes a lot through the nonprofits. And, they work obviously very intentionally through the schools and the systems of public education. So, but your second point about how does this not self-destruct is a good question. And it very well may. I think people are anticipating that it will. I would say, given what I've just explained here, it almost has to. Just in the same way that other Marxist experiments have imploded. So I don't think it's sustainable. But the problem is how long until that comes. It can be a while, and it can cause a huge amount of damage in the meantime. So I don't think we can wait around, for that implosion to happen. Yes, Don? Yeah.
So sort of on Diana's line of thinking, because I do wonder how this is going to play out. And they're obviously all in now.
Yeah.
It used to be at the university level. Now we're in kindergarten.
Right.
Okay, and we're working our way through everything.
Right.
And I think of, biblically, we know that there will be an Antichrist and there will be a one world government. I've never quite figured out when or how that was going to play out, but as I'm getting older, it seems like I'm coming up with some really good ideas. Okay, but, you look at China right now, and even Russia for that matter, but so these are some dominant world powers. They're feeding this fire. They're out for our destruction. And it makes sort of some sense that if this is a movement towards globalism, there's going to be somebody or country or leader, I don't know what it's going to be, but that's going to be in control of it all. And and they've got to deconstruct all these stakes in the ground that were placed in Western civilization. They got to get rid of it because you can't have that, people thinking for themselves.
Right.
And certainly you got to get rid of God,
right.
in all of this.
Yeah.
So I've said to many Christians, I said, we see that passage that talks about there will be wars and rumors of wars, nation rise against nation. And in World War II, many thought that was coming to the end, right? Because of the persecution of the Jews and all that was going on. But yet it says, but the end is not yet. And then it goes on to talk about how this is the beginning of birth pains. You have earthquakes and pestilence and famines. Well, we've seen all of that. But then it goes on to move on to the increased lawlessness.
Right.
See, that we haven't seen so much. And it was in 1992 when I saw the LA riots live, and I was there. I was in shock because I had just come back spending 2 years in South America in a third world country where that was par for the course because they were a corrupt government. And when I was there and I would have to, deal with some of this stuff, I thought, well, of course this is happening because they got a corrupt government and they're not looking to God. Praise God, I come from a country that's not going to do that. Until I saw those riots and it was like, okay, wait, something's falling apart here. And then what we've seen in the last year has been amazing, I think, for all of us, that this could all happen so fast.
Yeah.
I mean, 2 years ago, if we had said this is where we're going to be today, we'd go, oh, no, that couldn't happen in a year. Yeah, it can happen in a year. So I guess what I'm just thinking is that my hope is this will fall apart, that there will be people standing up. But I think as Christians, that passage goes on to say that they will hate you because of me. And kill you. Well, we already know our brothers and sisters are being killed in other parts of the world. But as Christians in the United States, we haven't faced a whole lot of persecution. I think we're going to get a chance here. I think we're going to get a chance to stand up because they're going to come eventually through these doors and say, this isn't happening here anymore. And are we going to fear man or are we going to fear God?
Mm.
But I will tell you, I mean, on one hand, it's sort of exciting because this is like it
Mm.
says, and then the end will come.
Mm.
Praise God, I can't wait till Jesus comes,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
But when you go through it, it
Mm.
can be a little nerve-wracking,
Mm. Mm.
but we need each other.
Yeah.
So, Scott, I'm very thankful that that God has, imparted to you to write
Mm.
this book
Mm.
to help us understand what we're
Mm.
up against
Yeah.
and how we can live as lights
Yeah.
to a world that is falling apart so quickly.
Yeah.
My neighbor and I just
Yeah.
had this discussion. He sees it, but I'm not sure he's totally understanding of the gospel of Christ and what he needs in that.
Yeah.
But he's like, what do we have left? 2 years? 5 years? I mean, this could come down really quick. I don't know.
Mm. Mm.
But even more so as Christians, we need to be sharing not only with those that are lost and
Mm.
sucked into this whole toxic new religion,
Mm.
but even on those that do see what we see that don't know Jesus.
Mm.
We need to help them understand you still need Jesus, brother,
Yeah.
sister. You
Yeah.
need this.
Yeah. That's right.
So,
Good
and may
thoughts,
God
man.
have
Yeah.
his way for
Yeah.
his glory. So.
Yeah, no, good thoughts. I think the only thing I might share, just in addition to what you said there, is that, yeah, I think those things, the Bible makes it clear, that dark days are ahead, okay? And then eventually, we know how the story ends, praise God. But we can anticipate the dark days, right? I think that's true. There's something that was attributed to Martin Luther that I really like. Somebody asked him, I don't know if this is true or not, but if Jesus came back tomorrow, what would you be doing today? And he said something along the lines of, I'd be planting trees. And what I take from that was that, things couldn't get dark and Jesus is going to come back, but I'm going to stay at the work that he's given me to do. And I'm going to leave those things in his hand, in his timing, in his hands. I'm not going to become passive. I think that's what I'm trying to say here. Because, no, it's getting dark and this is all foretold and I'll just kind of disengage. And I just think that's the wrong posture for us to take. We need to be obedient. And if anything, it's a unique opportunity for obedience. It's a unique opportunity to shine the light of Jesus in a way that's brighter, because things are getting darker than they've ever been. So there is a part of it that is kind of exciting. Nobody wants persecution, right? And yet we know God works through persecution as well. So again, I just believe these are the times that God's called us to. These are the places he's called you to be here at this time in this city. And, I just give you, I'm thankful that you guys are equipping yourselves to shine the light of Christ here at this time. It's important. Great thoughts. You guys are great group of people here. Let's move on. We have 20 minutes, I believe, here before we finish. And I want to talk a little bit about the church and how the church has been responding to all these changes in the society. Let's get the slides up for this session if we could, and let's put that first one up, Colossians 1:8. And Pastor Phil, so thankful that you chose this passage as kind of the theme, if you will, of our time together. It's just such an important passage in so many ways, when you read it all the way through as you've done. But particularly, this part that says, see to it that no one, Paul says to us, believers, see to it that no one takes you captive, enslaves you, right? How? How do they enslave you? Through hollow and deceptive philosophy. Philosophy is not bad. Philosophy is actually very good. You know what that word philosophy means? Philosophia. It's one of those words you got to break apart. What is Sophia? Wisdom. What's philo? Phileo. Love. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. That's what Proverbs is all about, right? We should be lovers of wisdom. So philosophy is not bad. We're talking about a particular kind of philosophy that's bad here. One that's hollow, that's deceptive, and it depends on what human traditions and elemental spiritual forces, demonic philosophies, rather than on Christ. So it's a warning. You can be taken captive. Christian, you can be taken captive by these hollow and deceptive philosophies. Don't let it happen. See to it that nobody takes you captive. So that's what we need to be about. Now, how has the church responded? Part of the reason I wrote the book, as I said, was because I was alarmed at the changes in the culture, but I really became alarmed when my dear close friends in the church started using the language of the movement, the white supremacy, white guilt, this and that, systemic, structural, all of this stuff. They were absorbing this language, using this language. I had one young woman, Hispanic woman, that I'm friends with. She's a church leader in Phoenix. But when she came to talk to me about this, she was very much taking the posture. At first, I didn't understand it. She came to our office, and she wanted to talk to us, meaning me and Darrell Miller, my mentor, my friend. Darrell's in his 70s, disciple of Francis Schaeffer, a very wise man. I've learned a lot from him, great guy. And she's in her 30s, I would say. She sat him down and said, more or less, without saying it, but the attitude was there, sit down, shut up, let me tell you the way things are. And it puzzled me. Like, what? I just hadn't seen that before. Like, usually there's some level of, especially when you're brothers and sisters in Christ, some respect for older people, even if you disagree with them, right? But then I realized in this ideology, you don't get respect through age. That doesn't matter, right? It's the authority to speak truth comes from the fact that you're part of a victim group. So she had seen, somehow at some level had taken that on and said, I'm the one now who's here to tell you the way things are. We wanted a discussion. We were like, let's talk, let's discuss, let's reason together. And it wasn't that way. It was, let me tell you the way things are. So that really bothered me, and I thought, I've got to figure out what this is. First thing I did was I said, okay, who's writing about it? Who's teaching about it? Surely God's raised up people in our evangelical movement in the United States that are out there speaking out against this stuff. And I could not find them. So I went to, and I don't mean to disparage, these are godly men that I've learned a lot from, people like John Piper, Tim Keller. I'm like, what are they? They must be saying something. This is after the first round of the Black Lives Matter movement was already kind of wreaking mayhem in the society. I said, surely they must be saying something. Nothing. So quiet, or if anything, kind of an equivocation. That really bothered me. Kind of the next step was I started paying more attention to our Christian universities because I've got kids in them, right? I care about them. I saw the same kind of lack of voice on this thing and the same equivocation and the same language of the social justice movement coming in, equity, diversity, inclusion. Read these resources. Start with Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I'm thinking, what? Ta-Nehisi Coates is an atheist. I'm like, what? Not that we can't learn anything from him, but why is this Christian university, well-respected Christian university, asking its students to start their journey with this whole discussion with Ta-Nehisi Coates? When I was just really, I thought we're really in trouble, because to me the hope is in God, but it's in His people too, right? It's in His people, God's people in the United States, being faithful to Him, are a voice, are a force for good in our society. We're like leaven, right? In a society, we kind of hold it together in some ways, in ways that we don't fully see or appreciate. Every day you guys are holding things together out there in LeGrand in ways you don't fully see or appreciate. But we have to stay strong. We have to stay rooted and grounded in the vine, right? Or the vine. We're the branches, He's the vine, right? So it bothered me that I wasn't seeing our leaders stepping up. I just was really, frankly, very puzzled by it, because I saw how quite clearly this was not biblical. At first, I didn't see it as Marxist. I took them at their word. They said, no, this is not Marxist. They denied that. But over time, I began to see that that's wrong. You might remember, let's put up the next slide. This is Michelle Higgins. And she spoke in 2016 at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship's Urbana Missions Conference. And that's the premier missions conference in the United States. Anyone been to Urbana? Don and Christine, not surprised. I've been there many times. It's powerful. Thousands of students from all over the country come, and some of the greatest missionaries in the world speak from the platform. The worship is unbelievable. It's incredibly powerful. God used it in my life in a very profound way. I love InterVarsity. I love Urbana. And here in 2016, Michelle Higgins, a young Christian lady from St. Louis, got up and she championed Black Lives Matter from the main stage. And she said that Black Lives Matter is a movement, this is literally her words, it's a movement on mission with God. And I thought, what in the world is InterVarsity doing by giving her a platform? Listen, if she was up there saying racism is bad, then fine, right? Fine, amen. We can hear that. We need to hear that. We still need to hear that. There's still racism that we have to fight against. But that wasn't her message. She was championing an organization, calling it something that it wasn't, a movement on a mission from God. That really bothered me because I thought it doesn't take a lot to find out, about this movement. It doesn't. I found out in about 20 minutes by doing a little Googling about the 3 young ladies who founded the movement. Here they are. Let's go to the next slide. Excuse me while I get my notes together here. Yeah. I don't have their names here. Opal Tometi is one of them. I forget their names. Oh, they're there. Oh, thank you. Okay, yeah. Elisa Garza described herself as a queer Black woman. She said, quote, "We must view the epidemic of Black violence through the lens of race, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity." Opal Tometi described herself as a transnational feminist, and the mission statement that they crafted for the movement included the statement that we exist to disrupt the Western prescribed family structure. So that was all right there on the website from the very beginning. Later, videos were uncovered just last year where they were on, film talking openly about they were trained by Marxists and they called themselves, Marxists of different stripes. But I thought, she must know, going back to Michelle Higgins, she must know about this. But apparently she didn't. I don't know. I couldn't. Later I found out, I asked somebody at InterVarsity, high levels on the board at InterVarsity, and they said we were stunned when she ended up on the platform, and what it turned out to be was I've seen this pattern play out over and over again. It was a minority, like 1 or 2 members on a 10-person board who were fully on board with this ideology, and they were going to push it in a deceptive way without the rest of the board knowing what they were doing, and they got away with it, and the next thing they know, Michelle Higgins is on the stage. She said, we were stunned by it. The board said, we were stunned by that. I hear that all the time. The people that are pushing this in our Christian institutions, it's a minority, but they're very disciplined and they're not afraid to use deceit either. And then the good guys, so to speak, the presidents of these organizations often are busy and they're not paying attention like they should. And the next thing you know, they've got board members and staff that are pushing this stuff right inside their organizations. And then they've got people on platforms championing it, and they're going, how did that happen? This is happening over and over again in our organizations, and I would even say churches. Looked at publishers, and I started saying, well, clearly there must be books that are being written about this, and these are the kind of books that I found. A book like this one, Woke Church, by Eric Mason, a pastor in Philadelphia, Black pastor, but really well-educated, Dallas Theological Seminary, Gordon Conwell. I mean, the guy's highly educated from respectable evangelical universities and schools. And yet he's writing a book about how the church needs to be woke and about how he wishes that the church had come up with the Black Lives Matter movement, and things like this. This curriculum, Be the Bridge by Latasha Morrison. Have you guys heard of this one? It's being used by churches all over the country. Right now, all the churches feel like we've got to jump on board all of this big race issue right now and teach our people about race. And Latasha Morrison's providing a curriculum. And so she's being used like crazy. If you've ever read the book White Fragility, it's a classic text, a popularizing text of critical race theory. It's this book, Latasha Morrison's book, is almost word for word white fragility, but with this kind of Christian veneer on the top, of it, So it's being taught in our churches. The Color of Compromise, Jamar Tisby, looked back at racism in the United States. He says truthful things here about racism in the United States. What's the problem with that? He doesn't talk about anything positive, right? It's just he's using that 1619 broad brush to paint America as one color, racist, right? It's hard to criticize it because it's true, but I always feel like if you're only speaking a half-truth, Even though that half is true, you're kind of telling a lie, right? So you're kind of telling a lie about our truth. Okay, these guys were being published. These books are selling. These are books being published by Zondervan, by Crossway, by Moody. Where's the books that are being published by people that have some concerns about this? Well, they're there now, but they weren't when I started writing. And so literally, I am not some big author scholar guy. I'm not even an expert on the topic I'm addressing you guys on. I'm just an ordinary Christian guy who cares about my country and my church. And, I thought, well, if nobody's going to write the book, I'll write it, right? So I thought I'll start writing on this. And I couldn't find a publisher either. So it kind of begs the question, why is this coming into? I think the church is responding in one of three ways to this ideology, and I think this is a typical pattern you see whenever a powerful non-biblical ideology comes into a culture. You saw, like, if you read Eric Metaxas's book on Bonhoeffer, he really does a great study of the church in Germany at the time that Nazism, National Socialism, was coming in. And the really sad story of how the church responded in these kind of one of three ways. Very hostile, powerful ideology. I think there's a lot of parallels we can learn today because it's probably 10 to 20%, maybe not even that many, that were pushing this Nazi ideology in Germany. This was not a German ideology. This was a foreign ideology, right? But the people that were pushing it had a plan. They were powerful, passionate people, and they pushed it hard. And the church, the three words are, they either kind of capitulated to it, if you will, conformed themselves to it. And you see these churches in Germany, they put swastikas up on their pulpits, thinking that if we, align ourselves with this new ideology, we'll be safe, right? Or kind of it's like it's coming in with such speed and force that if we're going to survive at all, we've got to kind of somehow conform ourselves to it. So that kind of capitulation conform group. Then there's this kind of accommodate group, which I think is probably a lot of Christians. They're not particularly capitulating to it. They're just not paying a lot of attention to it, and it's washing over them, and they're absorbing it. Kind of one presupposition after another. They pick up the language. It's, there's et cetera. So they're just kind of slowly absorbing it. I think that's a lot of the church. And then there is this minority that is resisting it, right? They're saying, no, we see it, this is wrong. In Nazi Germany, that was the confessing church, right? And they ultimately had to pay the price for that resistance. Well, why is it so appealing? Or why is it having such success coming into our churches? Let's look at the next slide. I think there's different reasons for it. This is a big reason. I think that it's kind of this Trojan horse deception that on the outside, right, the Trojan horse looked good, right? It's a gift. We want this. And on the outside of this movement, they use these euphemisms of justice and diversity, inclusion, equity, right? Anti-racism, things we all want, right? But then underneath, once you get underneath that kind of veneer on the surface, it's really a hostile, non-biblical ideology. I just think a lot of Christians are falling for that deception. They're not looking below the surface, and they're falling for the Trojan horse deception. I think, too, frankly, there's just so much. The people pushing this ideology, they use a lot of coercion, a lot of bullying, a lot of shaming tactics. It's created a lot of fear, and there's fear to speak up. And it's not unfounded. Like, people have lost jobs, reputations, livelihoods. We've seen the victims, so to speak. And so I think, frankly, there's a lot of just fear to speak up. We're going to get canceled or whatever it is. I felt that when we put the book out. I felt some of that fear because I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. And it hasn't panned out that way yet, but I felt it. Well, why did I feel it? Because it's having its fruit, so to speak, right? So, social pressure, that's the one I'm getting at. I think a big reason that it's also coming in to the churches, frankly, is I think one of the leading kind of wedge issues for bringing this into the church is the issue of race. Probably more than sex and probably more than the gender identity even. is the issue of race. And you remember last summer, especially after Floyd, you have to put up on your social media the Black Lives Matter little icon. Remember that? There was incredible pressure, because if you didn't, then what? Silence is violence. If you didn't show your support to Black Lives Matter, you were complicit in racism. I mean, that's heavy-handed tactics. But it works. I'm telling you, it works. And so many Christians put those icons up. I would say a majority of Christians did, and participated even in marches and things like that. So there's just a lot of that going on as well. But race, and the race is a really tricky issue, and I will simply say this about race. I found that, the thing that makes it tricky is our own history with this is so compromised. And the fact that we still have racism existing in the country, so it makes it very hard to speak about. But the one thing that has helped me a lot is when I realized that some of the strongest voices speaking out against ideological social justice, two things. Number one, some of the strongest voices are blacks. And I could name any number of names. Clarence Thomas, right on the Supreme Court, is one of them. Thomas Sowell, not Latasha Morrison, but Michelle Duson, and many, many others. A lot of them are not even Christians. They're courageously speaking out against this. And they're paying a heavy price for that, more than even white people when we speak out against it. So as I looked at these people that are speaking out against it, Robert Woodson's another one. What I saw there is I saw something that I hadn't fully seen or appreciated before in the black community in the United States. I saw that there was actually a history behind these two positions, that the black community, unlike Ayanna Pressley, isn't monolithic. There isn't just one voice, even though the proponents of Black Lives Matter would have you think that there's one voice. And granted, that might be a majority, but there's a sizable, let's say, minority of black people in this country that are not on board with that, nor have they ever been. There's a history that goes back. You saw a divide, for example, between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, who is very much a Marxist, in terms of his leanings, whereas Booker T. Washington had a lot more influence from Christianity, in his thinking, the founder of Tuskegee Institute, going all the way back to people like Frederick Douglass, right? And one of the things that I noticed on this issue, too, is that one of the great kind of proponents of American liberty, I think, and racial justice is Martin Luther King Jr. I've always believed that. And I think one of the high watermarks in our country on race relations was the speech in Washington, D.C. on the Mall. And in particular, that line that I want to live in America where we don't judge people on the basis of our skin color, but on the basis of the content of our character. And when he said that, it was prophetic, because prophetic in this sense, he was hearkening back to the Declaration, right? In some senses, the Declaration is kind of like the covenant, right? It's this American founding charter. And just like in the Old Testament, the prophets tried to bring Israel back to the founding charter of Israel, right? They spoke prophetically. I saw King doing something similar. I'm going to bring America back to that charter, because that charter says, right, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So he was building off of that. He was calling us back to who we were. And guess what? Almost everybody in the country at that moment, despite the history of slavery and of Jim Crow, we came together and we said, he's right. He's right. It was powerful. And we ended Jim Crow. We passed the civil rights legislation in 1964 and have made incredible strides since then. I say all that to tell you that today, the Black Lives Matter movement, critical race theory, and the social justice movement, when it deals with the issue of race, is abandoning those principles of the civil rights movement. It's actually moving in just the opposite direction. It doesn't want to see America that is colorblind. They view this idea of colorblind as being racist. They'll tell you that. I see being colorblind as a cultural achievement. They'll say, it means that you're not appreciating the history of racism and intolerance that still is happening to black and brown people today. And I say, no, I can appreciate that. What it means is that I don't reduce you and who you are to your skin color. I see you as a human being. first and foremost. Yeah, our ethnicities shape us, right? I'm 50% Dutch. That shapes me to a degree. Does not define me, right? Your race doesn't define you. That's what King was saying. That's what it means to be colorblind. So all that to say, I think what we have to do is we have to have the courage of our convictions on this issue of race to say, listen, nobody's going to accuse me of being for racism or being a racist. I hate racism. I hate racism so much I have to speak out against this critical race theory movement for that very reason. It is racist. It's inviting people to judge others and problematize them and judge them on the basis of skin color. If that's not racism, I don't know what it is. But I think we've been cowed into somehow feeling as Christians, if we don't support critical race theory and Black Lives Matter, we're going to be complicit in racism. We have to see through that. We can't let people shame us for being racist when we're not. And we have to uphold the principles of the civil rights movement. I think there's a really important place for us to do that. That was good. That was a good movement in our country. We're losing it. We're going backwards in race relations. So, just in conclusion on this, I would say this. The church isn't supposed to blindly follow mainstream cultural narratives, even powerful ones with massive elite support and financial backing. We are supposed to uphold and live out the countercultural ways of Christ's kingdom as salt and light in the midst of an increasingly dark and chaotic culture. Unless we, the church, pull our feet out of the ideological social justice quagmire and place both of our feet firmly on the solid ground of biblical truth, the consequences will be devastating for the church and the nations we exist to serve and to bless. Biblical justice is far too important and too central to our faith to allow it to be compromised by an imposter such as ideological social justice. So, that's my final word on that one. Let's stand firm, church, against this one, okay?
Amen.
Let's take some questions. So, yeah.
Thank you again, Scott. I do want to encourage you at this time to write down a question if you haven't already. If you do have a question already written down, if you just hold it up and our volunteers will come around and get that card and bring it in over here. And so we've covered a lot of ground, and yet this is in no way exhaustive,
Just
is it?
scratching the surface.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's just a number of things that I've got kicking around in my head that I want to throw out there, and I'll throw one of those out there now while we're waiting for some of these questions. Seems like the media is a big proponent
Yes.
across the board.
Right.
What media sources are you listening to for news?
Yeah.
For
It's a great question.
yeah.
Yeah.
Where
It's a
are you
good
going?
question. Yeah. One of the things I think we're seeing just this, the speed and force at which this is destroying and eroding institutions is really alarming, and journalism has been really, really affected by this. It's become corrupt in so many ways, and so it's become very hard to get news that is true, right? It's all, and they'll tell you, right? A lot of the mainstream media folks will tell you we exist to perpetuate a narrative. They see their job as fighting for social justice now, not doing the news in the way that it used to be done as kind of journalism, basically journalism. Yeah, they're fighting for social justice now. So what I have found just in my own life is that I can no longer follow almost any news agency. What I have to do is look for particular journalists. And I found some journalists that are truth tellers. Not all of them are Christians, but they're trying to, these are people like Glenn Greenwald is an example, or it's a woman, I forgot her name right now, but
Heather McDonald.
Oh yeah, she's fantastic,
Yeah.
Heather McDonald. But
She's not a Christian.
Well, she's not particularly a journalist. I'm thinking, I
No.
mean, she's a researcher,
She's
scholar.
a researcher.
But there are journalists who are truth tellers. Christian or not, they're committed to the truth and they're committed to journalism. So my encouragement to you guys on the news would be find journalists, and rather than news organizations, listen to particular journalists that have a commitment to the truth. And the one group that's been interesting to me to pay attention to is this group called the Epoch Times, because they have a background that I'm not completely clear about. I know that their founders came out of China. I think somebody once said they were associated with Falun Gong. I can't speak to that authoritatively, but I will say this. They see this has really taken root in the Chinese Communist Party. They see that with clear eyes.
Yes.
And they're truth tellers, right? So
along those lines is a group that is associated with the Falun Gong, and that's the NTD News. And so I use them.
Do you? Okay.
Yeah, I listen to their YouTube. Will delete their videos.
Yeah, okay.
They might delete ours. We don't know.
Yeah.
But they just give reports, like a 30-minute business report or a 1 hour, global report, and it's like, wow, facts.
Right.
Things, or at least that you can look into that yourself instead of mere narrative or constant politicizing. Just here's what happened, here's what this guy said, and so on. So, let's bring in the questions if there's any others. So it seems to me, Scott, that when we're thinking about ideological social justice that purports to have answers to why we are the way we are as a society and what we need to do about that, which of course is oppressor, oppressee revolution, that at the same time that they're purporting to have an answer is really they're just creating more problems. Do you see self-contradictory statements is a good way to kind of engage proponents of this ideology, to point out the kind of self-refuting views that they hold, and if you do, what would be some of the fastest ways to help kind of point out those flaws?
I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, so we'll get into this tomorrow in terms of the questions that I think it's good to ask people that are proponents. You want to ask questions at the level of principle, and you want them to defend making stances on principles that really are racist. And you want them to feel that tension. And the feeling is really important, right? Because so much of this is feelings based. It's got to go beyond kind of head stuff into, if you can get them feeling in a visceral way the racist nature of some of this stuff, for example, you can begin to make some headway.
And that's what we find in the church, as you were saying. This is usually promoted as an effort toward racial reconciliation.
Right.
And really for us, it's an opportunity to, let's read Ephesians 2 together.
Yeah.
And let's look at what happened in the man Christ, who was crucified and who brought together Jew and Gentile alike.
Absolutely.
And so we can proclaim the finished work of Christ. I'm going to move into some of these questions. So here's the first one. Why do the social justice warriors choose petty criminals as their martyrs? Why not the truly wronged who were really unfairly killed?
That's a really good question, I don't think that... So one of the big issues for proponents of critical race theory, critical theory, is the criminal justice system. They view the whole thing as shot through with systemic injustice, and that's a really big issue for them. The criminal justice system is really corrupt if you talk to them. And when you probe on that, you say, well, why? They'll go to disparities again, and because there are pretty vast disparities in terms of the number of people incarcerated based on skin color. And so then if you probe further on that, you'll kind of hit a dead end, right? Because, well, why are we seeing these kinds of disparities? They don't want to look beyond that. But so I think part of the reason if you're in prison and you're black, let's say, you're innocent. I mean, the system has done you wrong. So there is some of that going on. They just see these people differently than we might, where we're looking at the crimes they committed, for example, right? We would look at the specifics of what they've done that landed him in there. They wouldn't. They would look at just the system itself that's kind of doing them wrong, so to speak. So,
And what you said earlier, I think, is a big part of this, that truth is devalued. And so
that's right.
The evidence doesn't really matter. What the experts say carries the day.
And I've heard this same thing from Christians. In fact, my ongoing discussions with those early Christians that challenged me on this, I was taking it right away to the realm of discussion, evidence, what's really going on. And they pushed back after a while on that. They got tired of that, and they said, listen, everything is spin, Scott. Everything is, there's just nothing out there except spin. You've got your truth, and there's going to be other people that have their truth, and there's no way. And these were Christians saying this. And I thought, if that kind of cynical nature towards truth takes hold in the church, that's a huge problem.
Really is.
No, I get it, right? We can't ever know exhaustively truth about things. But that doesn't mean we can't know something very important about the truth of things, right?
Well, and we're called as a church to use righteous judgment, aren't we?
Yeah.
And so we have the standard, and that is God, his heart, his character, the word that he's given to us through the prophets and apostles, and finally the word incarnate, the Lord Jesus himself. And so, as a body, what do? We don't compare ourselves one to another. That's foolishness. We compare ourselves to who? To the Lord Jesus Christ. We realize that we fall short, we repent, and we even hold one another accountable to that perfect standard, even as the Lord himself says, be perfect because I am perfect, right? So really important. I think this is a great question. There's actually two of them here. Well, actually, it's one question with a follow-up thought. How do you get through to people who have had a quote-unquote repentance experience to repent of their whiteness and privilege? This seems specifically crafted to catch Christians. And so it seems that if this doesn't make sense to you, I guess what I would say, and I want to hear what you have to say, is inevitably, like the situation that you faced where you had dear friends sit you down and try to get you on the hook, so to speak, hook your conscience with, you're white and you need to repent, but you didn't go for it. But if you had gone for it, then you would have now had to self-atone, if you will, for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life. So what do you, does that make sense? So what do you say to a fellow Christian who got suckered into repenting of their whiteness?
Again, tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I think the more you look at this, especially on the issue of race, the more it's very clear that this is actually a very racist ideology. I read you earlier that quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, if he was in Germany and he replaced the word white with Jew, we would all see that, wouldn't we? Like, that is deadly. You can't say that. But he's using the word white here. And I want to challenge Christians on that. Ought we to do that? Is it okay to swap white, Jew, black? Can we do that? I want to appeal to them at the level of principle and help them begin to see that so much of the deceptive nature, so much of what this ideology purports, it's doing exactly the opposite. So it purports to be for justice. It's perpetuating injustice. It purports to be anti-racist. It's leading to racial division and racial hostility. It's racist. So we just have to help people see it, right? This is racism, If you, and I say this now to people, I say, if you hate racism, do you hate racism? If you hate racism, you can have nothing to do with this. There's a new foundation that has come out, and I'm so thankful for it. It's a group of, I wish Christians would do more of this, frankly. I sometimes think we're behind the game in terms of our secular counterparts, but a group of secular scholars and activists and speakers have come together and formed a network called FAIR, just in the last few weeks. And FAIR stands for the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I thought, what a great name. Because what they're doing is they're using the same playbook as Black Lives Matter against them, right? I mean, Black Lives Matter says if you don't, support our organization, it must mean that you think Black lives don't matter, right? Well, here's a group very shrewdly saying we're going to name our group the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and if you don't support us, you must be for intolerance and racism, which in this case is true. So anyways, I encourage you guys to look that group up. I think I would like to see a kind of a Christian counterpart where the key Christians, Vodi Bakum and others that are speaking out publicly against this, we come together in alliance as a kind of a united front, join together with our non-Christian allies and at least co-belligerents on this issue in the sense that we've got a common enemy, because I think that could be a strong center of gravity to kind of push back. So.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to, in your daily prayers, to pray for pastors and elders and churches across this country and globally to stand firm in Christ and to be rooted and built up in Him. And because, the Lord rules His church, does He not? Through the Word, as the Spirit indwells every member, and as we are submitted to His headship, Christ's headship. And so, I agree. We can, in many ways, feel like we're behind secular movements, and yet this kingdom will not be shaken.
Amen. Amen.
And kingdoms of earth come, and kingdoms of earth go, and so we have full confidence in the Lord. I've got another question here. Then I've got one of my own that I want to put in, or maybe some conversation that we might have openly. So this says, there's again two questions here. When the oppressors are the actual majority, for example, white males,
Right.
how does the outcome differ from Nazi Germany? For example, the Jews being in minority.
That's a really good question. I mean, you guys are asking really good questions. So as I understand it, and I don't really have an answer to that question. In Nazi Germany, the Jews were the minority, but they were viewed to be the oppressors, right?
Yeah.
And here it's the opposite. The majority are being labeled as oppressors in some ways, right? So the question, who wrote this question? Maybe you could clarify. Yeah, it had to be you. Okay. Yeah. Right.
So how does that play out?
Yeah. I don't know. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, frankly. I don't know. I'm not sure how that plays out. So.
Of course, they make everybody allies.
Yeah. It's a really good point. Your point there is really good. The LGBT movement, is one I think I look to because the number of actual practicing homosexuals is tiny. It's like less than 1%. And yet they exerted amazing influence, not as 1%, but what did they do? They got a bunch of people that weren't gay and lesbian and whatnot to view them as oppressed and to side with them. And I think that they're using the same tactics here for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
This is the other half of the question.
Yeah.
As a related question, should white males, especially young white males, seek to learn trades and simply avoid universities and professional careers?
Somebody answered the question back there. Yeah. No, I would say no. I would say I think that I'm sorry to contradict the answer there, but I do think it's important for people to, I believe in vocation. In other words, I believe God has a calling for people, and I think that calling can be carried out with as much honor and dignity in any kind of occupation, trades or not. So there's nothing lower or worse about going into the trades if that's what God has called you into. That's where you're going to cause Him to be glorified and extend His kingdom. So not everyone's called into universities, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to say, let's abandon the universities. I just talked to a guy recently who was actually in a large state university, I think it was in North Carolina, and he was studying in the Department of Sociology, and he was getting his doctorate in critical social theory, as an evangelical. And I said, why are you doing that? And guess what he said? Because the darkest place in the United States right now, and God's called me to be a light there. Woo! Was I thankful that God spoke to this guy and that he obeyed, and he's going into the dark places. That's what missionaries do. I don't know how many more are like him, but the fact that he's there doing that to be a witness, I hope he can stand, because it's going to be hard. He'll need a church. He'll need a community to help him stand. But thank God that there's people there that are being lights. We need that. So, anyways.
Earlier, one of our brothers asked, at what point do we parting and from one another if we are all professing Christ, but promoting different ideologies ultimately, because they're not, they can't cohabitate, can they?
It's tough, yeah.
And so, I just wanted to jump in on and answer that. And this might come as a shock to you if you're not a member of Grace Bible Church, but the elders were very plain with the members of our body, and we said we will be intolerant against it.
Yeah.
We will not allow someone to come in as a member of Grace Bible Church who holds to critical race theory, and we will not allow someone who is a member of Grace Bible Church to promote critical race theory, because it is heresy. It is false doctrine. And so we would go through the process of church discipline as we would with any other heresy. In my estimation, that's what local churches ought to be doing. Even as parents should be able to explain to their children why something their kid got caught up with at school may not be the best, whether it's a gang or maybe an ideology too that's coming through the classrooms. And so we have to be able to exercise the authority that God has given us with love, with gentleness, but not in fear, with courage, because ultimately, who do you fear more is the question. And Paul says, if I feared men or was seeking to please men, I would no longer be a servant of Christ.
Yeah.
And so stand strong. Stand strong. Know your Lord, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He has conquered, and we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb.
Amen.
This we are assured.
Yeah.
So.
Just a quick reaction to, I appreciate very much. I think it's a time to be putting down markers as leaders of churches and Christian institutions that provide clarity on this issue, to say, we're for this and we're not for this. It's really important. It needs to happen. There's a lot of equivocation going on right now. People say things like, well, they're saying some true things that are actually helpful. And I don't deny that. Like, there's no ideology that's 100% false. Muslims say some true things, right? But that doesn't mean Islam is right? It's still a heresy. So we have to be able to think in those ways. But I sometimes think, and I'm thinking a lot about this right now because I'm kind of advising university presidents and whatnot on this stuff by virtue of the book. But, to say we stand against critical race theory is good. But I almost think it's better to go down to the level of the principles that critical race theory stands for. Like, for example, we will not stand for any doctrine that's going to judge people and problematize them on the basis of their skin color.
Yeah.
So that's a little clearer than we stand against. If you stand against critical race theory, somebody goes, I'm not a critical race theorist. Well, they could be 100% influenced by that ideology using the language, but they don't put the label on. I did that, right? I didn't call myself a Marxist. So, if we can get down to the level, and this is, again, I'm thinking out loud even with you, but what are those really clearly unbiblical things that they're teaching? If we could get a handful of those things together and say, we won't allow this collection of ideas in the church or whatever it is.
And that's why we got to do what we're doing here this weekend, is spend some time thinking about these ideas brick by brick and working through some of the books so that we can identify what the overall worldview is and what the various components of that worldview are. Because it may be that someone got caught up with just one component of it, and when they realize that it belongs to a whole worldview, they would then subsequently reject it. We don't know. But we have to engage.
Yeah, we have to engage. That's right. And I think we have to see it clearly. Again, the key for me is to see it as a worldview. Because then it hangs together. And even if somebody's just taking a piece of it, we can help them to see it's part of this bigger system of thought, so that if you imbibe that, it's going to lead you to the next one and the next one, and pretty soon, that's the way these things work. So
follow up. You talk about 3 various responses of churches, or maybe parachurch, Christian organizations, universities, preschools, seminaries, mission agencies. Could be any of those, right?
For sure.
The way I've kind of been thinking about it over the last year is that we have either people surrendering to it,
right,
trying to appease it, or standing against it, fighting against it,
right,
and so kind of along the lines of, I forget how you worded.
Your appease and accommodate are kind of similar in my mind. Like we can kind of make some room for it, or we'll see some good in it. We'll use it as a tool.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So why not accommodate? Why not appease? Earlier you said it might work for a little bit. Well, what about the person that thinks that go along to get along? I can have my communion, worship time on Sunday during the week. I can raise the fist at work. I can do both and.
Right.
What would you say?
Again, this is because I have become so used to thinking in terms of worldviews. It's I always want to go back there, and say, and most people don't. I recognize that. So they're functioning at the level of, I'll just use these ideas at the kind of practical level, principle level, and so it's easy for them to do that. Now, there are some things I do think we can start sometimes with common ground. Like critical race theorists, for example, would say race is a construct. Right? That was used, it was invented to impose or to oppress black people. I mean, I have no problem with that. I agree with that. There's one race. The Bible makes that clear. There's a human race, and there's different ethnicities, but this idea of race is a construct. So I think this doesn't mean that we have to disagree with everything that they're saying. We might be able to find some common ground. But ultimately, what I want to do with people is help them to see this is a religion. It is an ideology, and it at root is atheistic. It's godless, right? So it starts in such a different place that inevitably it's going to go in a completely different direction, and it's going to take you with it, even if you pick up a little piece along the way that you think is okay. So I know that doesn't work for everybody, but that's the way I approach this. So
for the people who are concerned about being labeled racist, or bigot, or close-minded, maybe you're just concerned about the outcome of relations, right? What would you say?
My response to that, well, what I like to say to that is I like to ask the question, what do you mean by racism? Because racism has been redefined very clearly. So this new ideology defines racism in a variance of this. It's prejudice plus power, that only white people are susceptible to because they are in positions of cultural power. So that would be the new kind of definition of racism. And you white people have racism. I have racism, not because of anything I've said or done, but just by virtue of the fact that I'm white, because I've benefited from the systems that have been put in place over years to benefit white people. I'm privileged as a result of those things. So I have benefited from racist systems and structures, ergo, I'm racist, So I have to say, no, I don't agree with that system of racism or that definition, because it's built on all sorts of presuppositions coming from this ideology over here. I want to say that racism is what it is still in the dictionary largely, that it's treating people differently based on skin color in a worse way, or it's ascribing certain things to people based on skin color. That's racism. It's partiality in the Bible, right? So by that definition of racism, listen, I struggle with greed. I struggle with insecurity. I don't struggle with racism. That's not a sin that I struggle with, and you don't know if I do either. So you're not going to be able to call me a racist unless there's some evidence that you see me being a racist, and I resent you calling me a racist. I think we have to kind of just reject that. Right now, there's this sense that we have to kind of oh gosh, I've got to apologize for my unconscious racism. Don't give in to it. It's a bullying tactic. And don't ever own up to racism if you're not racist. Okay,
I'm
just as a bottom line.
kind of curious, just out here, how many of you have been told that you're racist or something along those lines for just speaking out? I have. Anyone else? Okay, yeah, a few of you. I'd love it if we could close in prayer and just remind folks that tomorrow Scott is speaking for the 5th time during our Bible study hour. That's at 9:30 to 10:30. And so that 5th and final session is really looking at kind of what are some proactive things that we can engage with as Christians with the gospel, as citizens in this nation, perhaps. I don't know if you're going to do that as much.
Yeah, no, I am. I'm going to
Okay.
talk about just how do you deal with it in your daily lives, because I know you're all dealing with it at different levels. And so let's look at that. What are the ways we should approach it very practically? Yeah.
Looking at kind of the constructive goals here, if you would. So everybody's welcome back tomorrow. We'd love to have you. We understand everyone also may be worshiping at your own church, so we'll miss you if you're not here. But we wanted to try to squeeze that 5th session in. With that said, Scott, any closing comments?
Again, thank you for the opportunity, Phil. Thanks for your vision for making this happen. And thanks you guys for taking time on a Saturday, wow, to come and be with us and learn about this stuff. So
Would you close us in prayer?
thank you, Lord.